In late 1915, a small volume of verse, Meta Dolorosa, by A.E.G., was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement. The reviewer conceded that the verses were a heartfelt tribute to the poet's son. What appeared to have escaped him, and indeed all subsequent reviewers of Meta Dolorosa, was that these heartfelt texts were much more than a mother's writing for a soldier son. A.E.G. didn't go to war. She never nursed wounded heroes. She did not hand out cups of tea at soldiers' canteens, and I doubt if she knitted any socks. Yet war, half a century of war, affected her as deeply, as emotionally as it can any human being. But to fully understand her writing and her discourse, we need to turn the clock back to the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, when there was a very obvious revival in chivalry, which had made significant ideological impact on the British upper classes. Chivalric ideals and concepts of masculine Christianity led to linguistic emphasis on honour, duty, self-sacrifice, terms often adopted during the Great War by those seeking solace for the death of a loved one. For the centuries separating the battles of Waterloo and Mons, war deaths had touched relatively few British families. Arguably, precisely because of its unlikeliness, the glorification of death on active service had been markedly on the increase. Similarly, the joining of this idea of Christian ideology of sacrifice and the Victorian interpretation of the so-called chivalric code transformed public attitudes towards those who died in combat. Officers' names were inscribed on rolls of honour, unveiled in their public schools with suitable aplomb by a military, preferably, dignitary, thereby encouraging every schoolboy and perhaps his parents to believe dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Civic memorials commemorated officers and men who perished in the late 19th, early 20th century South Africa wars, and for the first time the name of a woman, an army nurse, was inscribed on a memorial to those who had died for Queen and country. This increasing awareness of sacrifice and civic pride in those who laid down their lives in combat allows little obvious room for dissent. If war deaths were rare, the likelihood of children predeceasing parents due to natural causes had also receded. More affluent parents, at least, could expect their children to outlive them, leaving them with few emotional strategies for coping with the overwhelming grief that the loss of a child can bring. In their wartime grief poetry, many mothers attempt to develop coping mechanisms, and in A.E.G.'s case, discourse that will allow her to question both the war and find ways to circumvent the censor's vigilant eyes and sharp blue pencil. In spring 1984, Cambridge alumna Alexandra Grantham had taken Frederick William Grantham as her lawful husband at fashionable St. George's Church, Hanover Square in London. By training, Frederick was a lawyer, by profession a soldier. He was a collector and aficionado of Chinese art, and his position as the son of a Queen's Counsel and a scion of the British establishment sat very uncomfortably with the young couple's love of Eastern mysticism. Alexandra's early writings hint that their marriage did not receive Frederick's family's unanimous support. She was a feminist. Her redoubtable mother-in-law was a very active member of the anti-suffrage women's leagues. In April 1895, Alexandra gave birth to Hugo. Alexander followed shortly before the Frederick's departure for South Africa with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. Unlike many women of her social class and era, she was actually a hands-on mother. She didn't have her children looked after by a nanny, but actually she cared for them herself, and in her poetry, she recreates tender memories of oft times, singing lullabies to soothe an infant into sleep, spending long vigils by his cradle, peeping to see if he really were slumbering. The first loss of Hugo that Alexandra experienced was his departure to boarding school, to Cheltenham College's military side. He was rapidly turned into a typical product of his gender, age, class, and the British education system, with its emphasis on the manly qualities of sport and warfare. the benefit of hindsight allows us to cringe at Hugo's contribution to a February 1914 school debate. The motion was, in the opinion of this House, war is a necessary evil. He argued, war is useful in killing off the superfluous portions of the human race. The army provides work for the unemployed. Without war, this college could not exist, because there would be no military side. The motion was easily carried. Reading between the lines of his mother's wartime poetry, it is obvious that she knew who to blame for Hugo's smug views. She bitterly condemns those misguided rulers who succeed in luring young men to death with cries of fame, danger, duty, sacrifice. She is painfully aware that her family had subscribed to the ubiquitous patriarchal discourse. She has realised what this means, not only for her and hers, but for all mothers across the combatant nations who bore sons and in their beauty gave them back. In all her writing, she shows she is bitterly aware that the price for women of these seemingly masculine values, so praised by rulers and state, is unbearable grief. A man may arguably gain some form of glory. For mothers, every moment that her son is with the colours represents some torture in every nation. If in some respects the Granthams were a stereotypical socially privileged British family, other aspects of her life are far less typical. As well as being a feminist with strong views about women's political and maternal rights, she was, by birth, German. In August 1914, she was to many people an enemy. They lived in Essex. We've heard about the spy fever. There were people that were very concerned that somebody like Alexandra may in fact be a spy. She had to prove that she was very pro-British and that she had adopted her country's cause. Having lived through England's first war of the 20th century as a wife, German-born Alexandra would, like many other women, experience the Great War for Civilization as a wife and a mother. By September the 22nd, 1914, Frederick was in France. Recently commissioned Second Lieutenant 19-year-old Hugo was serving with the Essex Regiment. If in that earlier South Africa war, Alexandra had had young children to care for whilst their father was away fighting, history had repeated itself. 1911 had seen the birth of Godfrey, the child of the Granthams' middle years. He flits in and out of her maternal poetry until the moment comes for him to take centre stage. Many of her texts explore war in a philosophical manner, with her pondering why violence is used to solve differences. For Alexandra, war is neither just nor holy, nor should it ever be constructed as such. She dares to draw attention to what it means for women when lawless lust of conquest parades as righteousness, and godless things are done in God's name. One of the most poignant scenes in her elegy to Hugo, Mater Dolorosa, is written with an economy of style which highlights her agony. She joins other women as they bid their sons and loved ones farewell, their valiant smiles specifically donned to mask aching hearts. She shows an intense awareness of women's need to be publicly cheerful, not only for their own, but also for their menfolk's sake. Men may march to war to protect women, but in that moment of farewell, a gender reversal perforce occurs. The woman must protect the man, lest he should sorrow too, seeing thine own mother cry. It is as though she knows that if a woman lets her guard down, the man may be unable to cope. Hence, the brave farewell at Malden Station, as she watches Hugo entrain for the killing fields of the Dardanelles. How many of the women, who were so roundly condemned for cheering the boys as they left for the front, were hiding breaking hearts with hollow smiles. She advises womankind, when their sons towards far fights are starting, by the loud train, be mirth, not moan of fears. The gendering of warfare could hardly be more marked, Men stand by the train waiting for the whistle to blow and the station master to unfurl his green flag, leaving women behind to wave with trembling hands until the train is lost from sight. Indeed, stations highlight the differences between men and women's war experiences. The men set off to war, leaving women gazing dumbly after the departing locomotive, wandering home to empty houses where discarded cricket bats and silent gramophones await them. By now, Frederick was fighting at Richebourg on the Western Front. Maternal fears are for a short while replaced by wifely ones. News had reached the family home, Beeley Abbey, near Malden in Essex, that on May the 9th, 1915, Captain Frederick Grantham was believed to have been wounded and taken prisoner. Not too terrible a fate for a woman who was by birth German with influential family, both in Germany and in neutral Switzerland. Surely she could pull some strings and find out what had happened to him. Better for him to have been captured by her countrymen than left putrefying in no man's land. As Hugo and the Essex Regiment approach the maelstrom of Gallipoli, he is again at the forefront of her thoughts. She follows the campaign. Yet, however grave her anxiety, she hopes that her child will acquit himself well in the days that lie ahead. Maternal fears, hegemonic pride, and dissent intermingle in her poetry as these different sentiments vie for mental and poetic space. Temporarily forgetting her hatred of war, she greets with elation the news that during the unsuccessful battle for Krithia on June the 4th, 1915, Hugo had been mentioned in dispatches. She momentarily accepts the promise of military glory, which at other times she vehemently criticises. War becomes a time of marvellous endeavour. Philosophical condemnations give way to personal pride at her child's manly achievements. Meanwhile, attempts were being made to ascertain Captain Frederick Grantham's whereabouts. Was he really simply missing and wounded? Would there be sweetness when Alexandra once again saw her wounded man, long mourned as dead? Would the result of his homecoming be the joy of physical reunion? Now, another theft that war can inflict upon a woman is addressed in the intimacy of her poetry. Unusually for the time, she hints at her intense need, her sexual need for her husband. In distant Gallipoli, no headway was being made. Military wisdom decided to attempt another of those ill-fated last pushes. Held in reserve until the late afternoon of Monday, June the 28th, Lieutenant Hugo Frederick Grantham and men of the 1st Battalion, the Essex Regiment, and the 5th Royal Scots were ordered to attack Hill 12 from Gully Ravine, a diversionary action as the main fighting was centring upon Krithia itself. Supported by too few guns, this proved, as ever, fruitless. As Alexandra subsequently learnt, the men were torn to shreds. The following week, a telegram arrived at Beeley. Never again on this wide earth would Alexandra's mother arms enfold her child, nor strain thee to my heart. For Hugo there will be no homecoming. In death, the young lieutenant reverts to being the beloved little child, the son firstborn, whom she brought forth on a blessed Easter day 20 short years ago. In a typical grief reaction, it is the child who is privileged over the soldier. In July, she published her hymn to Hugo, temporarily accepting the current heroic discourse. Hugo oscillates between being my boy, born in entrancing peace, and my hero's son, blood of my blood, flesh of my flesh. At times, her consanguinity with her son gives her an entree into his masculine world of brave deeds and manly actions. Patriarchal discourse encouraged mothers to surrender their sons to the nation at war and to glory in their actions. For years afterwards, she will reflect upon the temporary willingness to buy into propaganda which sends to be killed or maimed a nation's flower. On August the 14th, 1915, a memorial service was held for Lieutenant Hugo Frederick Grantham at All Saints' Church, Malden. Meanwhile, in a Hardy-esque satire of circumstance, the Royal Munster Fusiliers were bringing in some of their dead who had lain in no man's land since the fierce fighting of May the 9th. A dog tag was found, bearing the name Captain Frederick William Grantham. His body had simply disappeared. Alexandra's maternal grief, however, was so overwhelming that she has no emotional energy left for Frederick. Indeed, anger, rather than grief, inform the few lines of verse directed towards him. It is as though he has failed her at the very moment she most needs his emotional and physical support. See before you a mother weeping for her child. She addresses him no more and directs her undivided grief towards their dead son. In 1917, war swept up Alexandra's middle son. Alexander Herder Grantham reached France in time for the bitter fighting of the closing months of the First World War. He was spared. A successful diplomatic career culminated in his becoming a widely respected governor of Hong Kong. Time and again, Grantham revisits the cost of war in terms of a mother's mental agony. She uses different eras: China under the Tang dynasty, ancient Egypt, 18th century Germany, 1914 to 1918 Europe. The technologies of war may change. The price demanded of mothers and women remains identical. Human rhythms have gone wrong. Drum taps call blood-intoxicated mobs to brutal battles. Mothers are powerless, unable to shield their sons from death. If the greatest wrong done to women throughout history has been depriving the mother of ownership in what so essentially belongs to her, the children to whom she has given birth, nowhere is that deprivation more marked than in wartime. The philosophies Alexandra had groped towards in her maternal grief had crystallized. In 1918, pencil speakings from Peking appeared. What the censor had failed to notice had not escaped the May the 30th Times Literary Supplement reviewer. Successfully reading between the lines, he acknowledges that although Peking is the text of Mr. Grantham's sermon, this is a diatribe against war and nationalism, couched in an exploration of Chinese philosophy. It is a powerful indictment of Western nationalism, with its bubbles of poison gas fermenting on a swamp of ignorance and fear. That the Times Literary Reviewer assumed this to be a male author's work may indicate belief that this type of writing was considered to be masculine. A mere woman might not be so bold. The Wisdom of Akhenaten soon followed. It's a verse play which presents a pacifist pharaoh who refuses to yield to the entreaties of his counsellors or the clamour of soldiers bent on forcing him to uphold his military prestige. Instead, Alexandra shows that his wisdom is to deny the benefits of war, and also the big words which encourage humans to howl for blood. The struggle hinted at in her elegiac Meta Dolorosa, where some temporary consolation could be found in portraying war as a time of marvellous endeavour, has been resolved. Modernism has won. Chivalric terminology might represent soldiers as laughing, leaping into the death none but a hero dies. But in reality, their gorges rise at the stench of severed flesh. They slip down dazed in their own vomit. She has rejected the comforting panacea of Rupert Brooke's peaceful foreign field that is forever England. She, her son, and a myriad of other mothers' sons' bodies are not washed by the rivers blessed by sons at home, but lie rotting in a distant land, their flesh disintegrating in the narrow, hideous darkness of an airless grave. The conflict is resolved, henceforth she will write as a pacifist. And still the bloody 20th century had a final blow for the ageing Grantham. Do you remember Godfrey, born in 1912, confirming all she had written about the war god's insatiable lust? On the June the 21st, 1942, death cast its shadow once again over the Grantham family. RAF Volunteer Reserve pilot officer and flying instructor Godfrey Grantham met his death in the skies above Repton in England. Alexandra took up her pen once again to commemorate this dearly loved child, this last beloved perfect son, writing in her maternal grief and despair, "What terrible times we perish in, can nothing be done to stop this Holocaust of the best of the young generation?" AEG's war story is one of extreme, often gendered, dissident grief. It spanned 3 wars and 4 decades. She never went to war. She never made the munitions of war. She never heard the monstrous anger of the guns, yet her life was as closely marked by war as a human being's can be. She was but one amongst many, as she herself recognised. They have become a multitude, the mothers who with old and trembling hands grope in the darkness, waiting for sons who will never return. A name on a panel at Le Touré Memorial to the Missing of the fighting around Neuve-Chapelle, France. A low headstone at 12 Tree Copse Cemetery, Gallipoli, Turkey. Grave number 407 in St Winston's Churchyard, Repton, England. The dust of 2 fragrant, symbolic roses, symbolising her youngest and her eldest sons, dropped as grave gifts into the darkness of Godfrey's tomb on June the 28th, 1942, are all that remain of 3 of the 4 beloved men in Alexandra Ethelreda von Herder Grantham's tragic, war-scarred, intensely feminine, feminist, and at times dissenting life. Thank you.